Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lit Up Lightworker Podcast, bringing you fun and soulful interviews with spiritual teachers with the aim of tuning you in and lighting you up. You can access all episodes of the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos and interviews all about finding and following your life purpose. My name is George Lizos. I'm a spiritual teacher, intuitive healer, the author of Be the Guru, Lightworkers Gotta Work, and the #1 best-selling Protect Your Light. And today I have with me Emma Loewe. Emma Loewe is a writer, editor, and environmentalist based in New York City. She's a senior sustainability editor at mindbodygreen.com, and she covers the intersection of sustainability and human health. She's the author of Return to Nature, the new science of how natural landscapes restore us, and the co-author of the Spirit Almanac, a modern guide to ancient self-care. Emma received her BA in Environmental Science and Policy with a specialty in Environmental Communications from Duke University. Her work has been featured in Bloomberg News, Forbes, and Marie Claire, among others. Emma, welcome to the Lit Up Lightworker Podcast for a second time. It's so excited to have you here.
Thanks so much, George. I'm excited to be here.
And I'm so excited to chat about your book. Obviously, the previous time you've been on the podcast, we chatted about your first book and ancient practices for self-care. And now you're taking it a step further, or outwards, I suppose, by talking about nature. Now, I want to hear a little bit about your story to connecting with nature and your story for using nature to restore your energy and getting to write this book.
Yeah, definitely. So, thinking about sort of the journey that led me to pen the second book, my background is in sustainability, and I do a lot of writing about really incredible, thought leaders in the environmental space. And something that I found when I interviewed a lot of them was that, when I asked them about sort of their inspiration for getting into the work that they do, a lot of them could point to an experience that they had outside in a particular landscape. So that sort of made me think, if a connection, keeping up with that sort of connection to nature really seems to be fueling a lot of the incredible climate work that we so desperately need right now. So that was sort of a jumping off point for writing a book that was about, ways to sort of help people interact and connect with the landscapes around them in the hopes that that inspires them to take more pro-environmental action. So that was sort of the idea behind this book.
I love the connection of taking environmental action and also understanding how nature can support us, because we get to have this partnership essentially with nature, whereas we don't just take from her, but we also give back to her. So I think by having this sort of appreciation and understanding as to all the ways she's nurturing us, we can also be more mindful around sustainability, around environmental policy, etc. Now, in the book, you talk about different landscapes like parks and gardens, mountains and highlands, ice and snow, rivers and streams, oceans and coasts, forests and trees, and deserts and drylands. And you also talk about cities and the built environment. I want to talk about that in the end as well, because it's one of my huge passions as well. So why those specific landscapes? And in your experience, how do different natural landscapes affect us in different ways, emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally as well?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. I mean, I split the book up into, different landscapes, just thinking about, different people will have access to different, areas, and not everyone gets the luxury to travel and visit, new places. So I really wanted everyone to be able to sort of find their home landscape, in this book and get ideas about how to connect with it. So that was definitely one part of it. But I also think a lot about some of the research that was really, new and cutting edge a few years ago about things like forest bathing, or sort of these different practices for different landscapes. And I wondered, I wonder if there's maybe an equivalent in, a landscape like the desert, for example, which I know you're a desert lover. So that was one, inspiration there. And I'm also just so curious about how sort of our upbringing and our lived experiences can sort of shape the landscapes that we feel most called to. And I also think that, in some ways we sort of hold all of these landscapes within us. So it's sort of interesting to consider, why a desert environment might be more prominent in your personality and your sort of, urges versus like a forest environment. So yeah, just sort of thinking about how those all come together within us, and then also within the world outside of us.
I love this, and I want to share a little story. I remember because I come from an island, Cyprus, so we're surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea. So that's a landscape that I grew up surrounded by and having a relationship my entire life. And I remember as a kid, I loved it. Then I moved to the UK. I went through life. I went through stuff, relationships, changes, etc. And then I found myself being like repelled by the sea. I did not want to go to the sea, and I found all these excuses like I don't like the sun in my like toes. I don't like the heat on my face. Like I was making excuses, and then I decided to ask myself like what is my resistance that prevents me from going and embracing the sea. And I realized it had to do with suppressed emotions that I wasn't willing to face. And whenever I would go out in the water, like the energy of the sea would inspire those emotions to come up, making me feel uncomfortable. So I would just avoid it. And that's when I started realizing how powerful like landscapes, natural landscapes are in helping us understand and navigate our emotional world, our thoughts, our physicality, etc. So I was wondering if in your research, writing this book and talking with so many people while researching it, have you experienced something similar? And from your own personal perspective, have you had similar experiences with natural landscapes?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's such an interesting observation. And, it's something that I did come across a lot when I was writing the book. I'll admit I sort of wrote it thinking that, perhaps one landscape would emerge as one that seems to have, quote unquote, the most benefits or be the most sort of universally appealing to people. But I really did find that memory just plays a huge role in the sorts of places that you feel drawn to and also repelled by. And it's interesting you mentioned the ocean, because I think that in particular, for whatever reason, seems to be a real keeper of memory for people. And perhaps it's something about the pattern of the waves or just sort of the energetic aspect of it. But a lot of the sort of research that I came across was just finding that people had the ocean sort of, it forces us to do some inner contemplation. So that's interesting. And yeah, it's something I definitely came across when I was working on this. I think for me personally, I think about, the landscapes I grew up in. I also grew up near the water. And I think that it holds a special place in my heart. But I also think that I feel really interested in and sort of drawn to the landscapes that I don't have as much exposure to. Like I'm sort of itching to go to the desert now that I wrote this book and spoke to so many people who really called that their home landscape. So yeah, it's interesting. It sort of goes both ways. We are shaped by the landscapes we grew up in, but we also maybe perhaps feel called to some new ones as well.
So what do you think is it about a landscape? I mean, what does it mean that we're attracted to one landscape and we're repulsed by a different one? Do you think it has to do with what? Like, what could it mean? What are some possibilities?
Yeah, so I think this is where, it's so hard to have an easy answer to this question, but I suspect nature is so obviously multisensory, and I think in a lot of ways it's unique in the sense that when we go outside, we're bombarded with different sounds and smells and feels that we don't necessarily get in our sort of day-to-day life. So in that sense, I think it really promotes a sense of mindfulness that can be difficult to find in other spaces. So I think that has something to do with it, and that when we step outside and when we have an experience in nature, we have exposure to a certain type of landscape, we're very mindful of what we're sort of taking in that moment. And that could perhaps be why, for better or worse, we feel a certain connection to different outdoor spaces.
Definitely, and we feel different emotions in different spaces. And you talk about the kind of energy as well as the science behind different landscapes, as well as you offer some practical exercises that people can use to connect with the different landscapes. So I was wondering if we can go through the different landscapes and just give us like a quick exercise for both, so people can get an idea of, okay, when I'm out in the snow, I can do something like that to deepen my experience with that landscape. So
Yeah.
when it comes to parks and gardens, what's like your go-to little practice that we can do?
Yeah, so gardens are fun. I mean, I think that some of the really interesting research in this space has been done in green spaces, so similar to sort of, parks, just because they tend to be pretty easy to have access to. So from that research, we've reason to believe that, looking out at a green landscape, so, a patch of grass, for example, for even as little as like 40 seconds is enough to sort of reset the mind and give, particularly like attention and, cognitive restoration. So I think that just taking, I call it, I think in the book, like a green micro break. So just either, stepping outside and looking at the grass for a few moments, or just looking out your window and sort of, taking in that view can just be a really nice way to rest the mind, and it's a nice alternative to maybe picking up the phone or things that we feel sort of, tempted to do in that downtime. So I would just recommend just looking at nature for a short period of time can be beneficial.
Definitely. I remember when I worked in London, I would go to the Kensington Gardens for my lunch break and just sit there and meditate, and I would feel so much more rested afterwards. So, how about mountains and highlands?
Yeah, so mountains are really, I think, one of the themes that I sort of came up against or came up upon when I was researching mountains was just this idea of awe. It's something that when we get to the peak or even, at the bottom of the mountain and see something really awe-inspiring, it can just, the sort of typical response is, your jaw opens, you get goosebumps, that sort of feeling of taking in something that's, larger than life in a way. And there's some really interesting research on awe to sort of suggest that it makes us more mindful of the present moment, but also sort of opens up our understanding of the world, just because it does tend to happen when we're faced with this like vast, view or vast stimuli. So I think awe is something that we could really benefit from, in our day-to-day lives, and something we don't necessarily get, looking at a screen, unless we're watching something awe-inspiring. But I would say, yeah, just chase awe, and in that sense, chase new experiences in nature, go explore a different part of your neighborhood, visit a place you wouldn't ordinarily go to, really hone in on what's going on in the nature around you. And I guarantee you'll find something that you find awesome, awe-inspiring.
Definitely. I always get a sense of perspective when I go up in the mountains. I have like a country house up in a village here in the mountains, and I always feel this sense of stability and security because I'm reminded that, I mean, people come and go in our lives, and we're all ephemeral, but mountains have been here, many of them, for so long. So they've seen so much, and yet here they are thriving, they're stable in the long term. So it sort of gives you this sense of, what, all is going to be well. Now, how about ice and snow? That's the one I have the least experience in. I've been to Iceland, it was a geographer's dream to go to Iceland. I so loved it. Definitely, I got some awe there, but I'm curious to hear about the science behind ice and snow and how that can restore us.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, ice and snow is something that I live in New York City, so I'm definitely exposed to it in the winter time. And I think that I, like so many people, tend to get outside less in the winter just because it's cold and I don't want to deal with that. So this is a really fun chapter for me to write, just because there is, I came across some research to show that even if people don't necessarily enjoy, their sort of nature walks in winter as much, some people do, but some people don't. But regardless, you tend to still get some of the same cognitive benefits once you take them. So I think that sort of, brings in the fact that you don't have to enjoy it to be, really, healed by it and to benefit from it. So I think one sort of mindset shift that helped me with, ice and snow landscapes is just thinking about them as a real opportunity to find quiet, especially in a city after it snows. It tends to be the one time of year that, people aren't necessarily out on the streets, cars aren't on the road. It's really just blanketed in white and sort of nature, consuming the city in a way. So I think that can be a really beautiful opportunity to, get out and meditate, or just get out and sort of, have that quiet moment of contemplation that you might not otherwise be afforded.
Yeah, I mean, even the color of snow is just so calming, so beautiful, and it just creates a sense of cleanliness and purity that just instantly connects you to it aligns you to who you are. And then we have rivers and streams, one of my favorite landscapes. So, what is something that we can do when we find ourselves in a river or a stream?
Yeah, so I think that rivers and streams are interesting because again, we can so closely draw parallels between, the run of a river and sort of the flow of our lives. And, I think they sort of lend themselves to contemplation in that way. So I would encourage people to maybe return to a river of their past and sort of sit with it and, consider the ways that river maybe has changed in their minds since they were last there, and also the ways that they personally have changed, and sort of make those connections between, as the world around me has changed in this way, I too have made these internal sort of shifts. So I think that can be a nice practice for rivers in particular.
Yeah, because they're all about flow and how things are changing and how things are shifting. So it makes perfect sense. And then we have oceans and coasts. Again, one of my favorite ones. This is actually something that I studied a lot when I did my bachelor's degree in geography. We went to oceans to study longshore drift and how oceans get shaped by how coasts get shaped by the oceans. And I found that fascinating, how a coast or a beach may look a certain way now, and then you go back there the following year and it's completely different. It sort of gives you a different perspective again about change. Now, we talked about water being sort of holding memory for people, but what is a practice that we can use to connect with that landscape even more?
Yeah, so I think with the ocean, there's so many things to touch on it, and so many things to really love about it. But one in particular I think is just the sound of the waves, and it's in a sense very universal, and that you can maybe hear an ocean soundtrack and it can resonate with you of, oh, that's the wave I went, the beach I went to when I was growing up, or that's sort of, my favorite beach landscape. So I think in that way it can be nice to just listen to that sound, wherever you might be. It's something I've started to do just from my desk at home when I'm sort of craving a bit of awayness. I just pop on an ocean soundtrack, and I really do find that it's calming. And there is some research to support this idea too, that just listening to wave sounds, if it's something that you do feel attracted to and not repelled by. I know some people do not like the ocean, but if you do have a positive sort of association with it, it can be very restorative and calming.
And talking about the sound, I don't remember the name of this website or an app. There is an app or a website, I guess there are multiple ones, where you can select different nature sounds, and you can even combine different nature sounds to have them like in the background while you're working. Great way to like
Cool.
incorporate like these landscapes into our well built environment. And what about forests and trees? I think many people will resonate with this.
Yeah, so there is some really fascinating research. Most of it's coming out of Asia about the sort of restorative health benefits of walking among the trees. And again, there are so many reasons, why we might feel so good after a forest walk. But again, I think a lot of it comes back to that sort of sensory exposure. So, some of the principles of Shirin Yoku, you might have heard of it as forest bathing in English, is just this sort of sensory immersion and engaging all of your senses when you're taking a walk through the woods. So that involves, smelling the forest air, which researchers are finding, there's this, insane, so cool research to find that, some of the essential oils essentially that trees give off tend to be like immunosupportive for us. So, in breathing in the forest air, we can sort of support our own, vitality and livelihood. So I think breathing in, the smells, feeling the things of the field plants that you can identify, don't touch anything poisonous, engaging the sense of sound. One practice that I did when I was with a forest bathing guide was, he told me to close my eyes and think about, just imagine that I was in a snow globe, and consider what is the sound that's sort of reverberating off the glass, so to speak, so the furthest sound that I can hear. And just sort of, experimenting with new ways to engage your senses, I think is very easy in a forest, just because there's so much to take in. And again, it's so different, from just the senses that are activated when we're, sitting in our desk or sitting in an indoor environment.
Well, yeah, completely. Cause there's just so much around you. So the plethora of sounds and senses is just so heightened. And I remember as a kid, because I teach a lot about dryads, the spirits of trees, essentially, according like the ancient Greece and many different other cultures around the world, ancient cultures particularly, they believe that each tree had a spirit, a dryad. And when I was a kid, I remember there was a specific acacia tree that when I would come home from school, like sometimes I would get bullied. I wasn't feeling very well, and I would always go to the acacia tree and just sit underneath, and I would always feel better afterwards. And then nowadays, I just go back, and it's so interesting that whenever I go back, I still feel like that kid feeling nurtured by that tree. It's amazing how when we open ourselves up to nature and trees, we can create those relationships, and they can allow us to nurture ourselves and support us throughout our lives. Now, when it comes to deserts and drylands, now you know this is my favorite landscape.
Yeah.
Why? Because most people don't consider a desert to be an appealing kind of landscape. But first of all, to people watching this or listening to this, deserts are not necessarily hot. There are cold deserts as well. When you go up in Siberia, for example, a desert doesn't have to do with heat. It has to do primarily with the vegetation in a kind of place. And the reason I like deserts is because they're so honest. I find them raw, I find them honest, I find them kind of sort of brutally honest, in the sense that you can't hide. There are no trees to hide behind. You're just exposed to the elements. And it's sort of a metaphor for emotional rawness and mental rawness. So whenever I find myself in a desert, I feel like, you know what? I'm just gonna be myself 100% unapologetically, and it is what it is. I can't hide. And it's just so liberating for me. Of course, the heat can be dangerous sometimes, but there's always a way to protect yourself, or you can go to more drier, colder places. Now, I'm curious to hear about your perception of deserts and drylands, as well as a practice we can use to connect with that landscape.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to hear more too about sort of, the practices that you do there. But I agree with you that deserts, they are very, I guess you could maybe call them unforgiving landscapes. In the book I touch on this idea. One desert author put it very beautifully. He wrote that, deserts are often the one landscapes that's sort of defined by what they're lacking versus what they, have to offer. So I think whenever we can, tune into what deserts are offering us, because they are offering, so much, and there is so much life, that's going on there. It's sort of just under the surface. So yeah, I would say a practice could potentially just be taking a walk in the desert and looking out for life, looking out for those different, like you mentioned, the vegetation in deserts. I find it so incredible that things like succulents exist, just because, they're such a beautiful metaphor for, just being able to thrive in very unhospitable conditions. And I think that there's, such a beautiful sense of resilience that we can tap into when we're in that environment.
Do you know how I got even more appreciation for deserts? So the flowers you see behind me on the wall, if you're listening to this on a podcast, you can go to my YouTube channel and search for this episode and see I have pictures of flowers behind me. Now, these are all flower essences that I take. So flower essences are essentially the essence of a flower. It's like a homeopathic kind of remedy. And it's from a company called Loewe, who is based in Phoenix, Arizona, in a desert. So many of those flowers are desert flowers, which I never expected for there to be such a wide variety of desert flowers. And many of them, they grow for a night and then they die, and that's it. They just grow for a day, and that they give all their life force, all their magic during this time, because it's a desert, for example, and then it's bye-bye TTYN. So there's definitely so much wisdom we can get out in the desert if we just give them a chance. Okay.
Absolutely.
And then we move into cities and the built environments. Now, most people don't consider this as nature. Personally, I kind of do, because we have nature in many of our built environments. So if we can't go out in nature, we can look into our built environment and find nature aspects to connect with. So what is a practice that we can use to, I guess, connect with cities, but also find nature in cities?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. I mean, I would agree with you that urban landscapes aren't necessarily places that people think they can, go and have a real nature exposure unless, they're privileged enough to live near an expansive park or something of that nature. But, as I was working on this book, I spoke with a lot of environmental psychologists and people, researchers who are sort of looking into the health benefits of getting outside. And I'd ask a lot of them, like, would you consider, city landscapes nature? And they'd say absolutely. And I think it's really important that people do, just because, if we have this perception that we can only really find restoration and calm in these like faraway places, it's doing ourselves a disservice, because it's sort of, making it so that only certain people have access to that. But I think it also could be potentially damaging, to nature if everyone feels like they need to go to this one particular place to find, restoration. So I think it's important for people to sort of be able to find that sense of calm and ease in whatever landscape they live in, including cities. So I think that's another argument just for, greening cities and really introducing more of these areas, so that everyone, has access to them. So yeah, with that being said, I think that one sort of fun ritual that I've tried to incorporate into my life is just going out into my city with a new perspective. There's this fascinating study that I talked about in the book that essentially found that when people head outside with, they called it an awareness plan, but it's essentially just taking on a different persona. So, say that you're pretending you're a poet looking out for your next muse, or, you're a geologist looking for some sort of, natural formation. It can really change the experience that you have. And I think it just goes back to that idea that it makes you more sort of aware. And if you're looking for something, you're going to find something, and probably something you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So yeah, I've been trying to do that. Last week I went on a nature walk through New York City with a naturalist, and she sort of pointed out all these things that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. And I really did leave the experience feeling like I had just gone on like a 3-day hike, and it was, a few hours in a city. So I think once we bring that sort of level of awareness and attention to it, we can be surprised by what we find.
It's all about perspective, isn't it? And something that I do, because right now, as I told you, I'm doing my master's in psychology. And for my dissertation, I'm using psychogeography to study the built space and connect it to nostalgia. So basically what psychogeography is all about exploring the city using an algorithm that disorients you. So it was introduced by a philosophical group called the Situationists a few years back, with the aim of challenging capitalistic expressions of the built environment. So, for example, when you go out to the city, you're gonna be guided by capitalism, by the shops. Like, you have to walk from this point to that point, looking at the clothes, and as you go through by. So there is so much that you miss. So what they did, they created an algorithm, they called it a derivative, that disorients them in the city so that they're forced to experience the city in a different way. That algorithm could be, and that's something that I use as well to experience whenever I go traveling right now, this is what I do. I create an algorithm, which is, I have an app that tells me right or left, randomly. So whenever I reach a crossroad, I'm like, okay, where should I go right now? The app says right, I go right. Then I reach another crossroad, where should I go right? Okay, go left. Or you get a map of a different city and you superimpose it on the city you're in right now, and you explore the city you're in using a map of a different city. Or you can throw dices, or you can follow a certain color or a certain sound. And it's amazing where it takes you. When I did this in my geography degree, we went to Barcelona, and our algorithm was blindness. So we blinded a person in the team, and we just followed the blind. So we weren't led by eyesight, we were led by different senses. And you just get to see so much more in a city that you don't necessarily see. 100% recommended. It's like life-changing.
That's so cool. I love that. Yeah, I bet that it completely changes the experience. Oh, I love that. So
Completely.
interesting.
So my final question is a personal one. What is your favorite landscape and why? And what is your least favorite landscape right now and why, do you think?
Yeah, it's so hard. It's so hard to choose. I mean, I think for me, there's, I touch on this in the book, but growing up, I had, and I think this is an experience a lot of people can relate to, but growing up, I had a tree that I looked out on from my bedroom window. And I think, obviously I lived in that home for quite a while when I was a child, and it's sort of that tree, I feel like, saw me through my formative years. And, it really did feel like another member of the family in a lot of ways. So I think that for that reason, I always feel a certain, kinship with forests. And I always really love the opportunity to go explore forest environments. So I think that would be my favorite, again, just because of that sort of memory and sense of place that it provides. Least favorite, I don't know. They're all great. Um, I think I would say the most challenging is certainly the urban environment. And I think that, because I live here and because it's very tempting to me to just stay sort of holed up in my apartment and not necessarily, go outside and explore on any given day. I think it's a constant, process and a constant journey to sort of just make this landscape my own landscape and really form, those connections that keep me really rooted here. I think that whenever I, again, go out with the mindset of, exploring and interacting, I always do come back, really appreciative of the landscape that I live in. But it does take a bit more effort, I think, if you are a city dweller, but it's always worth it.
Yeah. Essentially, you have to try when you're in a built environment because it's not easy because it's not everywhere. But once you shift your perspective, it is everywhere, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to try out your practice too. You've gotten me inspired. I'm gonna do that.
Oh my God, do it and let me know how it goes because I
Yeah.
am so excited about this. Now, what is your hope for the book? Meaning, how do you want people to use this book? And what is the ideal outcome for people using this book and doing something about it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a pretty simple hope, but I hope that this book, helps people get outside and explore a landscape they might not have, explored otherwise. And then I do hope that people are able to sort of take it a step further and, after they have that experience, to consider, a sustainable action that they can take to protect that landscape moving forward. I think this book really is rooted in the city of reciprocity, and, nature obviously gives us so much. So yeah, just considering what you can give back. And at the end of every chapter, there are sort of mindset shifts that can help you take more environmental action to protect that landscape. So I would encourage people to check out that part too, and don't skip to the to the beginning of the next chapter. Read this.
Exactly. Well, Emma, thank you so much for sharing these fascinating insights about natural landscapes. Where can people get in touch with you and where can people get the book?
Yeah, so the book comes out April 12th. It'll be available wherever books are sold, online, hopefully, in your local bookstore. If it's not there, certainly ask about it. And you can find me on my Instagram, which is at EMMLOEWE. It's where I tend to be the most active. And then my website, just my name. And then I'm, writing a lot for mindbodygreen, so you can usually see my byline there and sort of see what I'm up to.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. All the links will be in the show notes for people to access and wishing you a lovely rest of your day.